Alrighty, we are kicking off our content in Algebra 2 today. We are going to talk about domain and range, but first we need to discuss interval and inequality notation. So firstly, I am not going to ever look in your journal, so if you organize things slightly different than me, that is totally fine and up to you. As long as you know what information is where, that's all that matters. So here are some quick bullet points on interval and inequality notation. You are probably familiar with inequality notation. You know, the alligator eats the bigger number. So this one means less than, and this would correspond with an open circle because it's not underlined. Same with greater than, open circle. When we say less than or equal to, that's when we do underline it, and we would have a closed circle. Same with greater than, and then this symbol, that's an equal sign with a dash through it, represents does not equal. So vice versa with our interval notation, when we use parentheses, that means we have an open circle, the value is not included, or anytime we're using infinity. And then we use brackets if we have a closed circle or when the value does get to be included. So we are going to first practice going back and forth between interval and inequality notation and just looking at number lines first off. So if I have this number line here, I know that my values are from -3 to 5. So as an inequality, -3, x is in the middle, and 5. I have a closed circle at -3, so that inequality gets to be underlined, but an open circle at 5, so that one stays alone. And then for my interval notation, that would be from -3 to 5. -3 gets a bracket since it's a closed circle, but 5 gets a parentheses for the open circle. Okay, on B, open circle at 2 going off to infinity, that means that x is greater than 2. I do not underline it because it's an open circle and it never stops, so I only have one part of my inequality. In interval notation, that would be from 2 to positive infinity, 2 getting a parentheses because it's an open circle, and infinity always. On C here, I've got an open circle at 4 and an arrow going to the left, so that means x is less than 4. Open circle means I don't underline this. And then because this is values less than 4, my interval is going to be from -infinity to 4, both with parentheses because infinity always gets parentheses, and the 4 has it because it's an open circle. Okay, on the next two, I'm starting in inequality notation, and I'm going to work backwards to get to interval notation. This tells me that my graph is going to be going from 1 with an open circle to 4 with a closed circle, and I will just connect the dots. For my interval, this will be from 1 to 4, parentheses on the 1, bracket on the 4 to correlate with that open and closed circle. On E, I'm going from -2 to +2, and they both get closed circles, connecting the dots. And then for my interval notation, that will be from -2 to +2, both with square brackets. Okay, now we are starting with interval notation, and I'm going to work our way up to inequality notation. Here I'm going from -infinity to positive infinity, so that is going to be arrows in both directions. So that means as an inequality, all real numbers, and we do have a symbol that is shorthand for all real numbers. It's like a capital R with 2 legs, so you could write that instead of the full words, all real numbers. And then last but not least, I'm going from bracket 7 to positive infinity. That tells me a closed circle at 7 and an arrow going to the right. And so for my inequality, that means x is greater than or equal to 7. So now that you've got some practice with those interval and inequality notations, we are going to use them to describe domain and range for different graphs. So remember, domain is your x values or your inputs for your functions. Range is your y values or the outputs for your functions. So I've got these graphs already drawn in. Feel free to pause and add them as you need. We are going to describe the domain and range for each of them in interval and inequality notation. So I'm going to do inequality notation first. For graph number 1, I've got a parabola, and it's going off to infinity in both directions, so my domain is going to be all real numbers. My range, my y values, however, it starts where y is 0 and goes off to positive infinity. So y is greater than or equal to 0 is going to be my inequality notation. Closed circle here, no open circles, so the inequality gets to be underlined. For my interval notation, all real numbers is -infinity to positive infinity. And my range, y is greater than or equal to 0, will be bracket 0 to positive infinity. On this next graph, as an inequality, my domain, because it stretches forever in both directions, is going to be all real numbers. And my range is also going to be all real numbers because it stretches vertically as well. Then in interval notation for both of those, it's going to be negative infinity to positive infinity for both. Okay. Moving on, we'll call this one 3. I've got another parabola, but this time I have an open circle at my vertex. So in inequality notation, looking at my domain with the x values, I have this gap here where x is -1. So I have all the values less than -1 and all the values greater than, I'm sorry, it's +1, and all the values greater than -1. But that is a lot of writing, so what we could just say instead is that x does not equal 1, and then we assume that it is all of the other values. Our range starts here at +3 and goes off to infinity, but we have that open circle, so I just will not underline my inequality. Then representing each of those in interval notation for my domain, I have to include the numbers less than 1 and the numbers greater than 1, and I'm going to put a union in between them since they're both part of my answer. And then for my range, I will go from 3 to positive infinity, both with parentheses. I'll call this one number 4, this horizontal line, starting with inequality notation for my domain. The domain is going off forever, both left and right, so it's all real numbers. My range, however, is only at 2, so y equals 2 is the only y value that we have. And for interval notation, my domain is all real numbers, negative infinity to positive infinity. And for my range, it will look very similar, just that y equals 2 because it is only at 2. Okay, we'll call this guy number 5. We've got kind of two parts here, little arms, if you will. So starting with inequality notation for my domain, we have values where x is greater than 3 or equal to 3 because closed circle, or values where x is less than or equal to -3. We would not use the exclusion here because there is more than one value that's excluded. And then for my range, we're starting at 0 and going off to positive infinity, so y is greater than or equal to 0. Putting both of those into interval notation, again, I will have two intervals for my domain, negative infinity to -3 with a bracket because it's a closed circle. And then from 3 to positive infinity, also with a bracket because of that closed circle. Just putting a union between them since they're both part of my answer. Okay, then last one for this page, starting with inequality notation. With my domain, I've got all of these negative x values and all of the positive y values, so that would be all real numbers. Then for my range, again, I have horizontal lines, and so this time we have two values, though. We have y at 0 and y at 4. So just converting both of those into interval notation for my domain, negative infinity to positive infinity, and I'm running out of room with that little hole. And then for my range, it will look similarly formatted, y equals 0 and y equals 4. One last detail to end off our day. On the last graph I'm going to look at, I only have certain points, not the points in between them. So when we're doing interval and inequality notation, we get to include all of those partials, like 2.1, 2.3, etc. When I only have points, we can't use those notations because it's just at these specific points. So for 7 and 8, to list my domain and range, I have to use something called set notation, which is going to be set up like this. Starting with my domain, you're going to use a squiggle bracket. And so x such that x is how you would read this, but we're just going to list off the x values that we have here. We've got -2, -1, 0, 2, and 5, and then I'm just going to close my squiggle bracket. Then I will do the same thing for my range, but with y such that y is, and then I'm going to list my y values. My smallest one here is at -1, then I have +1, +2, +4, and +7. Okay, same thing for 8. For my domain, I have to use set notation, so all the x values such that x is, I've got one over here at -7, -3, -1, +1, and +5. Then lastly, our range. I'm going to look at my y values. I've got -2, +1, +3, and +8. So that is set notation. We've also talked about interval and inequality notation. One last thing, with that last graph that you were given, let's practice how would I draw a graph with a domain like this. So I want to make sure that I have x values from -2 to +3, and everything is square brackets, so I know I'll have closed circles. And then I want to make sure my range goes from -4 to +5. So basically, this resulting box is where I will draw my graph. So we can put 2 closed circles at opposite corners and draw a line connecting them. That would work. You could also do the other opposite corners. You could kind of make it bounce like a parabola if you wanted. There's multiple ways to do this, but that's just one other thing that you can do. Once you know the domain and range, you can create your own graph. And that wraps up our first day of notes for Algebra 2.